Okay, so welcome to the next round of talks. I'm Brett Littman, the Executive Director of the Drawing Center, and I'll be doing two fairly quick-fire talks with two different collaborative groups. First with Hipkiss, with Alpha and Chris Mason, and then with LaMarche Obiz, both who have a relationship to the Drawing Center, and I'll explain through talking to Hipkiss about the project that we're working on that's going to open at the Drawing Center. Not working?
Not working.
Okay. Okay, yeah, much better. So we'll talk about the project that we're working on for the Drawing Center, but I wanted to actually preface both talks with a little bit of a personal reflection. In 1996, I started working in New York in the art world at a place called Urban Glass, which was a glassblowing school and studio. Glassblowing is an extremely collaborative craft, so oftentimes there are multiple people working on one object. Through that experience, I ended up spending a lot of time in Scandinavia, both in Sweden and Finland and Denmark. And in the 1999 to 2001, I wrote about 10 articles about collaborative groups that were coming out of Scandinavia. Those groups like Front, which was an all-female design group, graduated from Kunstfack with 1 degree. It was very radical at the time, and they created a lot of problems for the university. There was a group called Ugly Cute. There was a group called We Like Ceramics. There was another group that was called, let's see, Studio 126, I think. And there were all of these kinds of groups that were mostly working in craft materials, collaboratively, creating objects and creating them under one name. And for me, it was quite fascinating to think about both the politics of that, the aesthetics of that, how can we judge whether or not collaborations are successful, and also this idea of the third hand. I mean, meaning the kind of merging of two different styles into one fused artwork. And so it's a topic that I've been thinking about and have written about quite a bit about 20 years ago, and it's a topic that still remains interesting to me today. So I was very happy that we could have two different groups that are working, both men and women, together. And one other observation I'll make is in this fair, there are several other collaborative groups that are also using drawing as a way to express themselves and to make their work. So I don't know if it's a particularly European model. In the US, there are examples also, you know, the Kabakovs, I mean, the Christo and Jean-Claude in a way. There are other examples of these kinds of collaborative groups. But it's interesting that in drawing, there seem to be more groups that are working together or creating work under one name than in other mediums at the moment. So I just wanted to preface the talk with that. In any case, I think that I came across Hipkiss's work probably first. It could probably was at the Folk Art Museum, maybe. I mean, you had work. Did you have work in the Obsessive Drawing Show?
Yes.
Yeah. So probably Brooke Anderson, who had done that show, introduced me to your work, and that was maybe 16 years ago. Could it be?
2005, I think.
Yeah, I think it was in 2005.
Okay, so about 13 years ago. And, you know, I have to say that it surely made an impression on me. I had seen some other work later at David Zwirner through a show that was done with a gallerist that was collaborating with David. And at that point, I think we met here in 2015, possibly.
Yes. Yeah.
And we had a conversation that began a very long dialogue about trying to make a show. At first, it might have been more of a survey show. In the end, it turned into be more of a commission for the Drawing Center. But I've really appreciated your openness and willingness to kind of work with me over a long period of time through fits and starts to try to develop a project for the Drawing Center, which to me is an incredibly important project, and also one of my final collaborations that I'll be able to do as the director. So Thank you.
Thank you. We feel very honoured to be among your last shows, in fact, there. And it's been a pleasure all the way through, even with the ups and downs, to get this show made.
Thank you.
And ready, and the catalogue and everything.
So I think what we're going to do is we're going to look through some of the earlier works that you've made. We're going to do that fairly quickly in the respective time. And maybe if there's some things that you want to bring up, there are one or two that I wanted to talk about in relationship to the work that the Bulwark project that we're doing. But could you just start off and explain for this audience how you work together? Because I think it's a very important way of opening the door to understanding the process and also how these drawings operate.
I think it's essential to us to a certain degree to not so much explain the technical things about how we work together, but the fact that we do in the first place. Because for 30 years now we've been in the same studio. It's our atelier, but it's also our workplace. It's also our
Not very
eating
big
place.
either.
It's our workplace. The cats are there. At one time there was like 6 or 7 cats on the same table, and we were every time we needed to eat, we used to have to take the drawings off, take the cats off naturally, take the computer off because we had a computer there on as well. But yeah,
Hold it up to your mouth a little.
like that, yeah.
But no, I think in the 90s, because we had a lot of different ideas going on in a lot of different spheres, we didn't even explain it as a duo, even though it was. We went to private views together, and obviously we were always thinking on every project as a duo. But it seemed quite odd to call yourself that when you were drawing, when the actual output was a drawing. But in actual fact, we've come to see ourselves far more as a sort of filmmaking outfit, where we both, the ideas come from both of us, the techniques are developed by both of us, but in the end it's generally Chris who does the drawing and me adding bits here and there. But because we wanted a seamless look, that's how it developed over years. At first we were drawing together. I'm very technical, if you like, more academic as an artist. I had a bit more schooling, I suppose.
Yeah, and generally I could spend too much time doodling. There's a lot of spontaneity to it. But sometimes it lacks
sense of humour as well.
it lacks cohesion, and it's only when you spend many hours discussing how you're going to do the next work or what ideas you come from, that input of someone who has much more of a realistic approach in landscape and in compositions, that everything comes together. And I think the success that we've had over the years are almost entirely due to that synergy that you have with two people.
So Chris, I mean, for you, the kind of, I don't want to say rules, but I mean, the boundaries that maybe Alpha creates through the narrative. I mean, again, it's not about that you make the drawing and you make the stories. I mean, I think the film production metaphor is a very good metaphor.
Yeah,
it's the best metaphor that I can think of in terms of how that works. But I mean, if you were to go off on your own and make drawings, you're saying that maybe your drawings would be a little looser, a little sketchier, a little different, or...
Well, I think sometimes I've done that, and they tend to become more design orientated. They lack. I certainly did that in the 80s, where I spent a lot of time alone, and they were student work really, not even as good as that. And because I lacked any direction. It was only when we spent all the time together, almost 95% of the time together, while we were working on pieces in the same place, that we managed to get any kind of control over the quality, because it was quite low.
Where were the breakthrough moments, though? I mean, you started collaborating in 1983?
We met in early 1983,
okay.
and we took about, I suppose, 6 or 7 years to iron out our creases as people.
Right, as human beings, and right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that took a while, naturally,
Mm-hmm.
and we tried me working rather long hours. I was in the computer business at the time, which was sort of the opposite end of things. We were both quite into maths, but yeah, it was I don't know. It took me away from the house far too much, and it was really only once we were in the house together, virtually 24/7, when I stopped working in that industry and up in London,
We did spend 2 years on unemployment benefit,
Yeah.
which really did help because
Okay,
although
so going on the dole is a good way to kind of get a collaboration started.
It is.
with no money you can't.
Yeah,
with no money you start to find your creativity comes much quicker when you don't actually.
I don't think that's possible now. Certainly not in the UK. But certainly then it helped us just to have a pause in life to find out what we wanted to do, I suppose.
So 1990 could be a kind of, was that a kind of breakthrough moment in the sense of now you've kind of established, you've stopped working full time, you're focusing on making art, you're both working together in the same space, you've kind of ironed out a system of communication and how you're going to be able to build images and thinking through bodies of work. What would be the next step? I mean, we're looking at some later work here, 2000. You know, was the 90s a kind of decade where you ran out a certain style of work? Were you changing things rapidly during that decade?
It was more technically getting to grips with what we had between us, because as well you have this kind of push and pull of not styles so much as ideas of how the pencil should look. I suppose it is technique really. So yeah, it was those years were very formative. It was also, I suppose, a time when we weren't on the internet. The internet didn't really exist so much, so certainly not in an everyday sense.
I think the pictures coming here, certainly the next picture, is that's the beginning of some works that we were working since 2006, called the Jerseyan series, and it was where we live now, very much inspired by the landscapes, the paysage, and also the interactive life we have with nature, because we live in the country.
That was perhaps the next big landmark, wasn't it? It was when we moved. We lived in the countryside in Britain, but it's not the same thing as it is here in France. You know, I mean, real deep countryside where we live. We're surrounded by cows, chickens, our own chickens, deer, wild boar. It's you know, the noises around are not cars, are not people. So yeah, it's quite a different thing, and I think it's where we belong, to be honest. Because that's more of an inspiration to us than anything else, is nature and how humans fit into nature, I suppose, really.
Well, I think with your work, there's I mean, and particularly starting in this body of work where there's a kind of push and pull of the urban and the rural and the atavistic sense of nature and the kind of chaotic sense of, you know, human interaction, and also maybe that borderline between when you're driving from the country into the city and you're about to pass over into this other place. I mean, I feel very much in this body of work that you're always right on that line between these two places.
Yeah, exactly. It's called suburbia to a certain degree.
Yeah, or exburbia would be another term.
Yeah, or the edge city. Yeah, that's something that's always inspired us. That although we always wanted to live in the countryside, you certainly start, instead of looking at the city, you look to other landscapes. You certainly look to the landscapes of the East, and the landscapes of the East, metaphorically, are this exurbia place, almost dangerous, but not. We're not trying to create some kind of apocalyptic sort of scene, but we are at the same time trying to put an edge on something. Put an edge on the landscape.
We haven't mentioned here, actually, in that sense, is that we both dream of architecture. We always have done for some reason. So there's always a desire to put that in from a purely, it's kind of a need to put it in because it's there in our heads very much all the time. The intricacies of buildings. You could see that from that first picture, the slide that you put up, which isn't early, but still early enough to see. But when we went to New York, it was overload, you know, to see so many fantastic buildings. But yeah, we're both quite interested in agricultural structures, all that kind of thing. So it's never pure countryside as well. That pure need to put that kind of stuff down affects how the compositions turn out.
Well, I think the worlds that you create are always, to me, feel somewhat familiar, maybe a little... how would I mean, not disturbing. I mean, but they're worlds in which I kind of think I know what those structures are, but maybe they're factory buildings, they're buildings, modernist kind of buildings, they're towers or spires, but as you really start to explore them a little bit further and go deeper in terms of looking, they move into a kind of dream realm. I mean, they move into an area in which then I can't really put my finger on them, and I'm not sure why the juxtapositions of these architectural structures are together in the same landscape.
Yeah.
Very often neither are we.
Yeah.
Well, I think at the same time, I think we are very conscious of that fact, conscious that we're not looking for the symbols, obvious symbols. So we try to create our own, whether they're unique or not, but we spend little time looking at other artists' work to a certain degree.
Yeah.
It's not through lack of interest, but it's more of an attempt at least to not keep the same symbolism that you have in the contemporary world.
I want to talk about this particular drawing because then we're going to skip over a couple of images, but we were talking about this earlier in relationship to the tower pieces that you've been working on pretty consistently since about 2015, and which is part of the project that we're doing together. You mentioned to me that this drawing was maybe the first time that, or I don't know if it's the first time, but an example of trying to fuse together a series of drawings to create a longer piece, a longer narrative.
Yep.
And maybe that it didn't quite work because, so it's interesting to see this piece, and then later I'll show the works that you're working on now for the Drawing Center.
It's always been size has always been a bit of a thing for us. The idea
Yeah, you guys scale up really quite large in your works.
And it never quite works for us. It never quite works. It's always a letdown. You can spend 2 years making a massive work, and at the end you think, the composition's just not right. And, and it's very hard to do that on a long roll of paper.
This one works as separate drawings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has a certain flow, so you could sort of move them around and attach them, but it's the practicality of doing something so large, so divided as well, and trying to bring that all up together. It never works like that. And we tried it many years ago, but some of the first drawings that we did were very large, and they have the same lack of continuity. And it's something to do with the fine detail that you put in, as much as it is to do with the overall. It's
very easy to lose focus on the big picture, basically.
Well, I happen to really, for instance, like there's the piece that Kohler has, which we were going to originally borrow back. I mean, I think that piece is like 6 feet by 12 feet long. I mean, it's like a giant Chinese scroll or Japanese scroll. I mean, it's a pretty impressive drawing. I mean, I'm sure it probably took you several years to make that one. There is something that's quite impressive about the scale that when you do scale up, but readability is hard. I mean, you can't stand in front of that. You have to really scan the object and start from left to right, right to left, stand in the middle of it. You never are able to take in that whole drawing.
No.
Yeah.
No, and it's for us as the creators. It's never quite there.
well, that was 30 foot long, but it was meant to be 3 times as big. It meant to fit the whole town hall. But then there was the problem again. The minute you had 3 pieces, you couldn't possibly conceptualize the landscape. So you just left with 3 pieces again.
Just a mishmash, which really was. They look better actually. And that was my fault, that picture, but they do look better slightly apart, which is really where we moved on to with the towers.
Let's go, if you don't mind, I want to get to the first preparatory drawings for the show that we're doing, Bulwark, and maybe could you talk a little bit about the concept that you developed for the show at the Drawing Center and your thoughts? There's a lot going on in these towers, and obviously there's also some history in terms of a project that you were doing in Limoges and how these kind of the form came about.
Yep.
Might be interesting to talk about that for a second.
Well, yes, we were commissioned to make a set of plates with a porcelain company in Limoges. Very fine artisans, very perfectionist, which is why they still haven't come out, the plates, but it's still ongoing, the project, funnily enough. But yeah, we happened to just create the designs on one long roll of paper. So there were seven discs, effectively, 7 circles. We thought, hang on a sec, if you put that vertically, it looks really good. So we've sort of struggled with having people in our works for a long, long time. when we were younger, you used to put in sort of literal images of people and birds and all the kinds of things that we were into then, I suppose, into drawing. But as you get older, you don't necessarily want to. You want to make something that's a bit more monumental, I suppose, and less literal. So for us, the towers became a kind of way of drawing portraits. And particularly this set for the drawing centre are they're literally plants, they're weeds, they're massive, spiky, thorny, swirling weeds, people in the form of weeds.
And in this drawing, you know, it kind of gives the first iteration. I mean, you really wanted to fill the whole space of the drawing room with, I think, something like 26 or 30 of these.
Well, more if we...
No, more, 40 or 50. I mean, we've ended up with 13, which probably took you right up until last week when we picked up the work. So obviously it's a kind of, you know, it was an ambitious project in the sense of the way that you originally conceived of it.
We certainly conceived it as black and white, as something from the earth or the sea, so there was some kind of confrontation between the two things. But I think with the events that have happened, the unmentionable events that happened all over the world, that was too obvious in a way. Just to leave it with something that someone had to face just seemed to work better. Less is more in a way, I think.
The room, turn around, and then see
Right.
the bulwark.
I don't want to give the spoiler, but if you do come to the drawing center, you'll walk into the gallery, and the first look you're going to have is of an empty wall. You're not going to see anything because of the way the gallery is oriented. Yeah. You're going to have to turn around, and then on the back wall will be all the works that are hanging on a, I think the color is Rapture, if I remember correctly. It's the color of paint. So you'll have a kind of, you know, very interesting background with these 13 drawings hanging spaced on the wall. So this next slide is 6 of the 13 works. There was a term, which now I'm not going to remember, but what's the beautiful term for birds that are based in geographical local areas that you guys used? I know there was in an interview.
Like avifauna.
Yeah, avifauna, yeah. So all of the towers have avifauna, no? Meaning birds that they're kind of birds hidden.
All our work does, effectively, you could say.
Really, everything going back all the way back into the 80s?
It's got more and more, I think, over the years. As we've become, especially when you live in the countryside, you do actually start to go a little bit mad. And if you're both into birds, it becomes a bit of an obsession.
Do you have a life list?
We have what you might call a yard list.
A yard list, okay.
Which is 91 species at the minute. We're on a migration path, which is lovely for people like us.
That is an incredible amount of species over 10 years for one single space.
Our land, yeah. So yeah, it's the traces of birds are everywhere. Sometimes the words are sort of bird sounds. We saw an artist recently who actually takes photographs of birds moving like fractals. He's called Xavier Booth.
He's a Catalan artist, BOU. We were just waiting at the doctor's, and we were flicking through National Geographic, and apparently he's made quite a lot of success with these sort of like still framed photographs, traces like barbed wire almost of birds.
Quite incredible. But it reminded us.
Suddenly it reminded us of what we do here.
Yeah.
Well, it's also like those films of swallows, or what were the birds that make those kind of incredible flocks?
Starlings.
Starlings, right? Exactly.
Starlings, yeah.
I mean, it's funny. I've shown this work to a lot of friends and colleagues, and one thing that keeps on, the one comment I keep on getting back is that it feels very Islamic.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because of the ornamentation and maybe the kind of the level of detail. It's almost like Islamic decorative tile work or Girith tiles or kind of these systems. So people are asking me whether or not there are kind of mathematical systems at play in the development of these works.
I think that's very incisive for you to say that, because it is actually something that when we started it, that was almost a direct reference to an idea of removing the people aspect and then turning the decorative idea, and also the lack of landscape. Removing the landscape and removing the people to present a connection to that, that type of art.
Well, you said that in an interview that by removing the kind of detail of the landscape, that these works freed you, or have freed you for a period of time, to conceive of ways of building, maybe a complex image, vertical image, which allows you to focus really on the details within the sphere. So to draw the viewer even deeper into that level of the microcosm, I think, that exists. I mean, these works are so incredibly detailed. I mean, I think I'm going to have to get magnifying glasses for people to see them. I mean, I think there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be standing in front of them for many hours trying to decode them.
Yep.
But freeing yourself from having to deal with the background has allowed you to go deeper into the works.
Yeah.
I think that's huge. Yeah, I think that's.
We do have a bit of a horror vacui, actually. So it's a way of giving ourselves space to breathe. There's also, I mentioned earlier that we come from a mathematical sort of background as well. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying, because although we're by no means mathematicians, we think in quite an ordered way. Certainly for me, I studied pure maths at university the first time round, and it's ever present, the beauty of the natural world in its mathematical descriptions, I suppose. Yeah.
And also practically, as one gets older, it's difficult to work on something so large. I've had problems with my back over the past few years, so working on these longer, thinner drawings has certainly made it easier to do.
Well, this to us is the ideal way of making a big drawing.
Yeah.
Because it does, and for us, I think the expression snowflake that came up a lot in 2016 and still does is quite interesting, because it's another idea of the circles. Here we've got 91 snowflakes making a bulwark. To us, they are sort of statues of liberty as well. These are our portraits of the Statue of Liberty. It's an idea of France giving something to New York again as well. There's those aspects. So it's many faceted, really, the whole project. And as we've done more, we've got more and more into what significance they do have for us, and hopefully for the audience too.
Well, I think it's nice that you've chosen a kind of form that you've been able to explore now for 3 or 4 years, and maybe you might be done with this form now. Who knows? Maybe you'll continue to make towers, but. What I like about this is that your work is also, this body of work is very accumulative. I think it picks up like a vacuum cleaner, like a lot of things that you've done over the years. And I see that kind of injected in a micro scale in every one of these drawings. So if you do know your work, this work is a kind of, I don't want to say it's the culmination, but it is a kind of moment of, and maybe all of your work has had that kind of experience of taking a bit from everything and moving it forward. Which is, always something I would imagine as an artist that one wants to do.
Yeah, and very often it happens out of the blue, like this, like designing some plates and, that's
right,
really good.
That works.
I'm sure you find the same thing. Sorry, talking to the audience.
I think it is, it has really changed the way it's almost like a real success artistically, which is what we've been searching for ever since we started. And I think it's almost like a catharsis in a way, even though it came just out of the blue. This idea, because I know to a certain
chaos, isn't it? In a way,
I think we
like
were hitting brick walls at certain times with drawings. Where do we go? I could quite happily see us continuing doing hundreds.
Though perhaps we'll turn them up the other way and make trains. We're not sure yet.
Exactly. So, Chris and Alpha, thank you very much. I think we should, if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to my next interview. Yep. But thank you, really, it's wonderful to hear you talk about the work. And the show opens next, not next week, the week after at the Drawing Center. So if you're in New York, please come and visit. And really a pleasure to see you guys. And I'm sorry you can't come to New York, but we'll send you some pictures, and we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
a lot, Brett.